can't believe that 65% of startups fail because of conflict between founders.
It's insane. Biggest business risk that no one's talking about. Your gender, your cultural identity, your family life, that definitely informs how co-founders work together.
Is there any point in time where you actually tell co-founders you work with that they should break up?
Yes, I do. Welcome to How I Met My Co-Founder. I'm your host and team relationship expert, Annie Garofalo. And here's your all-access pass into the conversations that can make or break a founding team.
I'm Crystelle Desnoyer, and I'm your guest host. We're reversing the roles today, and I get to interview the one and only Annie. A bit about me. I'm the former chief of staff to the CEO of Techstars. It was the first company I worked at I hadn't built myself. I built 27 US entities for foreign and Chinese B2B tech, B2C, and investment companies. I now work as a fractional COO and head of partnerships, and I'm on the board of La French Tech New York running tech events. All of this requires fostering relationships, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And funnily enough, Annie and I met at a Techstars alumni and partners networking event in the city. You all know Annie as your host. She's a leading expert in the study and support of co-founder relationships. Yes, it's a thing. She's a former founder herself who went to graduate school at Stanford to specifically research startup teams using tools from couples therapy and relational sociology. So over the past 3 years, she's worked with 50 early stage teams backed by leading investors, including, of course, Techstars, Antler, A16Z, Sequoia, and Y Combinator, to proactively prevent the co-founder conflicts that kill 65% of startups. Did you know that? This is crazy. Let's kick off with a question from one of your listeners. So the question goes, I want to learn more about you and how you got interested in this space. So can you walk us through, Annie, how you decided to specialize in supporting co-founder relationships? It's such a niche area.
Thank you so much for that question and for being here, Crystelle. You're the best. I'm so excited to have you here as a guest host.
Thank you.
And thank you for your kind introduction.
Of course.
Let's see. It's a great question. How did I get into this space? It is a niche. I am a former founder myself, as you mentioned. Back in 2017, I founded a company with one of my best friend of 2 decades. So we knew each other incredibly well, practically sisters, like part of each other's families, and had this deep knowledge and understanding of each other over the years. And when we reached 2017, we'd graduated from college. She had studied fashion. I had studied business. We were both in those fields professionally and thought, oh, we're very complementary. We love to travel. We love textiles and crafts. We should start a company where we source textiles from amazing places in the world and sell them online. So we started working together in that capacity. And despite our headquarters being in a foreign country where we didn't speak the language, building business relationships in a way we'd never had before, we struggled most with our co-founder relationship, which was one of our biggest surprises. And it not in the way of we were having arguments all the time or anything like that. We just would have differences of opinion or differences of definitions and what it meant to be a co-founder or what it meant to build a business. And that was really hard. We didn't know how to have those conversations. We hadn't had those as friends. We were sitting in Guatemala kind of Googling co-founder support and came up with nothing for the solution except for that stat that you mentioned, that 65% of startups fail due to co-founder conflict. And so the fact that that is such a big business risk and yet there's no interventions in the space is what opened my eyes to that need. And so that's what led me to grad school. I spent 3 years specifically studying this through my MBA and master's in sociology, using couples and romantic relationships as a parallel and bringing in different principles there to finally start the research on co-founder relationships.
Amazing. What a story. And so I'm just curious, looking back at that moment with your co-founder and the knowledge that you have now, if you had the tools that you have in your mind now, would that relationship have been completely different? How would that journey look like?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It absolutely would have been different. We would have had a lot more upfront conversations. We definitely tended towards, let's just go ahead and figure it out. And I think that's very important to be a founder. You need to be able to be adaptive and flexible. And so that's very important in a lot of aspects of your company. However, when you're starting off and you're joining a partnership, you should know more about the other person and about yourself. Like there is an element of flexibility that's important there, but there's also an incredibly important understanding of the past and who you are as individuals and as people, and there's more data there. And so the fact that we didn't talk through that data or those profiles or how we show up in the workplace. She kind of grew up professionally in fashion. I grew up professionally in management consulting. They have very different cultures and understanding of business. So for us, one of the biggest differences would have been having those harder conversations up front.
I can only imagine. So let's talk about the prenup aspect of going into co-foundership. I know that would have helped prevent a bunch of situations for founders that I've met, but also within situations of companies that I've built myself. Just curious, before you marry into that co-foundership, what does that look like? What does that process feel like? And it must be so uncomfortable, just like any marriage, when somebody says, I want a prenup and the other one doesn't. I'm just curious what this process looks like for you and in the methods and methodology that you've developed.
You hit the nail on the head. Whenever I talk with people about, oh, should I co-found with this person or not? The first green flag is if they're willing to have these conversations. And if there's not that willingness there, then I say, really think about that, because if the willingness isn't there today, it's probably not going to be there when things get hard. So that's the first indicator.
So communication
and willingness.
Shocking.
Yeah, exactly. Profound. But you'd be surprised how many people are like, oh, shoot, yeah, that I probably shouldn't start a company with that person. So it's pretty amazing. And then once you kind of have reached that, you align on both wanting to have these harder conversations and understanding each other and your motivations. I think about it across 3 different areas. And this is what my partnership agreement program is based on. Is part 1 is doing a retroactive look at the past. What are your own working styles? What are good working relationships you've had in the past? What are hard ones? Why are you founding a company? And studies show that it's either wealth or control as a primary motivation for founders. And so which one are you motivated by? Which one's your co-founder motivated by? And like have that dialogue, as well as what are your personal priorities? What else is going on in your life in the next 3, 5, 10 years? And be very clear and honest about that. So it's like a retroactive look at the past. Then there's a look to the future and making sure you're on the same page with what you want your long-term roles and responsibilities to be.
Your preferred exit maybe as well. Some don't want to exit because it's a mission-driven thing, and some are totally excited to exit, just like you said, driven by wealth.
Yes, exactly. Ideal exit, contingency planning, if maybe one person can imagine themselves leaving the company for a personal reason or out of conflict, but how do you want to be dealing with those exit scenarios? Very hard to have that conversation alone without a facilitator. And then there's that final category of, okay, what does that mean? How do we operate today? How do we make shared decisions? How do we give each other feedback and performance reviews? And what are our compensation and equity plans? So that's how I think about that agreement process.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things to look for, even if you're not actually building a company as a co-founder, it's just asking within companies, how do you resolve conflict? What's your conflict management tools and methods? Frankly, a lot of companies don't have any when you ask that question. So good interview question for those listening. But I'm just curious, what's a method to resolving conflict? And, in some books, they talk about committing while disagreeing and things like that. I'm just curious how you guide founders.
Yes. I like to give founders a lot of different models. And that's one of the reasons why I started this podcast, honestly, is to understand. And I ask every team that I interview that question. How do you manage conflict? What's a disagreement? And how do you move forward? And we've had teams that say, we disagree and commit. Like, we disagree a lot and we're okay with that as long as every person feels like their piece has been heard. And whoever's that final decision maker will make that choice. And that person commits to that and commits to that being what's best for the company. They don't try to sabotage it and move forward. That's kind of one side of the spectrum. And then the other side is consensus, decision-making under consensus. And if you're in disagreement, listening to the other person's perspective or finding a compromise that works for both parties, or multiple parties before you move forward. And there was a married couple where that was their approach, maybe because it had to be, because otherwise they have so many other shared facets of life that they couldn't. Different models work for different teams. My approach is giving all of the options and then working individually with each team to say, okay, what works for you? And likely when I work with teams, they say they want one thing and then we work through a few conflicts like that. And then they realize that actually they work better with a different kind of style and they get to a resolution faster or with a different set of priorities than they ever thought. And so it's very important to experiment as well. You're not going to get to the right conflict management style after the first disagreement you have.
That's great insight. I was actually going to ask you, you have co-founders that are couples. So is that different to other co-founding teams that are not married or couples?
It's definitely different. I would put this with couples, with close friends, mother-daughter, family businesses. They're definitely different because you play more than one role in that person's life. When I work with those teams, some of our conversations do center around, like, for the next few weeks, I only want to be your co-founder. Like, I actually don't have capacity in my life to have a personal relationship right now. And that can happen. That's harder for couples, like if they're raising a family or don't have that ability to take that space. But for friends, I've seen that personal relationship and the professional relationship, the proportion ebb and flow over time. What makes that okay is the clarity of it. That can be really hard if one person is distancing themselves and the other is seeking that attention or wants to maintain that relationship. So you need to be having these conversations as you're realizing that you need that space.
Yeah, upfront communication, expectation management.
Again, shocker.
So we got a question submitted from a seed stage founder, and she says, I need to have a hard conversation with my co-founder. She just aren't meeting the deadlines we are setting. How should I think about approaching this conversation?
That's a tough one. In an ideal company, you already have feedback check-ins on the calendar. So you already have that space to have that conversation, because the first step is getting something on the books and figuring out the when, right? Like, is this the type of feedback that can be delivered asynchronously or over Slack? I'd say be very careful. Like, the answer to that should 90% of the time be no, just because there's so much room for misinterpretation, even though it might feel easier and clearer to write it down and send it. I'm a full supporter, write it down, maybe don't send it. Write down what you want to say and then figure out the right way to deliver that. My favorite process for teams is to have just a 30-minute check-in with the co-founder, between the co-founders every other week. And maybe in a particularly intense time, it's every week. Maybe in a particularly easy time, it's once a month. But have that on the calendar. And in that time, you have set questions. The questions that I like are, what have I appreciated about my co-founder in the past 2 weeks? What's something that I would like to change about how we've been operating, or a frustration that's been on my mind? And that frustration, I would recommend it be something that is just, even if it's just a little pinch, just increasing your heart rate. Before it becomes
a big problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Keep those small, lower the threshold for what you're willing to share, and just share anything that kind of comes to mind as it is. Like, as whether it's urgent and super important, or ideally not that urgent, and you give that kind of urgency metric. And then the third, closing out with an ask. Just like asking your co-founder to help you with something, whether it's something social, something emotional, something functional. But that is shown in research to strengthen relationships, being able to offer each other help very explicitly.
Well, asking for help is super vulnerable, but also giving help is very empowering.
Exactly.
And yeah, it definitely strengthens the relationship and bonds and just that.
And without that
energy.
Structure, it's really hard to ask, to make that ask. As well as, like, to this question, it's hard to give feedback in an unprompted space. And so, again, we talked about the kind of the what you're talking about, really try to write it down, think about it beforehand, to the when you're having that conversation. And then there's 3, the how, which is checking in on it.
I think that's the hardest, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely the hardest. And it's the most prone to error, because you don't know how the other person's going to react. And it is a two-way street. So the first is, you need to ask that person if they have the capacity to receive that feedback right now, and be okay if they say no. If they say no, ask them to commit to another time, but don't flood them, because that's not going to be a productive conversation. So that's kind of the first thing, is check for capacity. Then deliver the feedback using, everyone's heard this, but using I statements and feeling words. And so in the circumstance of our listener who wants to give feedback on deadlines, the way that she could frame it is, this past week, we had an internal deadline we set to get our pitch deck completed by Tuesday. And I worked overtime on Monday to make that happen. And I saw that we didn't make that deadline because of some of the slides that were your responsibility. And so that bothered me, because I had put my my time on the line. I overworked myself on Monday, and I probably didn't need to. So I'm curious what happened. What happened there, and approaching that with curiosity.
Would you add like, it made me feel XYZ
Yeah,
to show that vulnerability aspect?
yeah. It
'Cause-
made me feel frustrated or alone or confused, hurt, all of those things. I personally struggle with feeling words, which is maybe why I ended up doing this as a career. So what I have printed out and laminated at my desk is a feelings wheel.
Oh, amazing.
And it has it's like different I guess it's like slices of a pie.
Yeah.
And each one is, the center is like the 4 or 5 core emotions, and then it kind of goes out and gives you more and more of a vocabulary.
That's very cool. I'll go check that one out. I just finished reading a book called Permission to Feel.
Mm-hmm.
And they have an app that gives you 80 some plus words to describe how you feel. Because a lot of adults lack of the specific word to describe how they feel, apart from good, bad, meh, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, so we'll drop that in the show notes, as well as the feelings wheel. And then I'll also make sure to include a link to nonviolent communication.
I read that when I was 23. It was very helpful.
Very helpful.
Actually, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about co-founders are either married, but also co-founders are female and male. And how does that, is there like, just differences that you see, or is it more because we're in 2024, it's gender fluid and it's more about energies rather than genders themselves?
That's a great question. And I think that it gets to your lived experience is informed by so many identity characteristics, like your gender, your cultural identity, your family life. Like there's so much that goes into who you are and how you interact with the world and in your relationships. And so, yes, that definitely informs how co-founders work together and how they prefer to manage conflict and how they prefer to be talked to. I think one of the biggest differences I've seen is actually more cultural. And in different cultures, there's more of a, maybe I'm frustrated by this, but it's disrespectful for me to bring it up. And so I will not bring up this feedback. I'll just kind of harbor it in like within myself, and I won't discuss that feedback. And I've seen people who have that background versus maybe someone who's coming from a more direct family where there's yelling and not yelling in a way that's toxic or too far. But I think I came from an Italian American household. It's just very loud. It's very loud, and that's how we talk. And it's not even like we're having major conflicts. But when you pair me or like someone who has that preference or that profile with someone who comes from a background that's more of a, you keep your conflicts to yourself or very quiet, the way that discussion happens can even feel threatening to different people. And so we do a lot of work in my sessions talking about what might be feeling threatening, building that understanding, and then also communicating intent, apologizing, repairing. All of those are very important, especially when you're talking to someone who has a different background or style preference to you.
I mean, building that mode of operandi from scratch is so key, right? In order to move forward, especially if you come from different cultures, different backgrounds, and just different ways of doing things. Incredible. Is there any point in time where you actually tell your clients and the co-founders you work with that it's totally okay and they should break up?
Yes, I do. I'm very much, to me, success is not that a co-founding team stays together all the time. I think that is definitely one avenue for success. I also see success as an amicable split, when that split happens for a very good reason, whether it's that the co-founders aren't working well together and it's just not sustainable, or maybe someone's life priorities have changed and they now want to focus on something else or need more stability in their life. Like starting a company is very hard and very unpredictable. And so a lot can happen that makes a breakup make sense and be the best of the options. I think there can be costs to the breakup, to the company, to the co-founder, to the investors, that's very detrimental when it happens unexpectedly, or when there is a lot that's being harbored there and it's all of a sudden brought up and it comes out and hasn't been talked about in advance. Like there's that lack of understanding, that lack of clarity, and that can be really damaging. Again, not only to the company, but to like the remaining founder as well. to have a successful split, you need to be aligned on values and what you're committing to each other in terms of how you want to be showing up, how you want to help each other in the next phases or not, but at least be honest about that. And then also figuring out how you want to be managing your investor relationships and all other stakeholders, how you're communicating to the team, and put aside your differences to figure out what that narrative is and make sure that the future role of that co-founder who's departing, that it feels fair to both parties. I think that there's some teams too that work together for too long and when they shouldn't, and that can lead to a toxic work environment. And so I would encourage people, like, if you're thinking like maybe this isn't the right fit for me, like maybe it's not. Give yourself permission to think that and like think through what that could look like. Don't just say we made a commitment. It would be so complicated to break up. Like that's not a good reason. It's the same thing with romantic relationships. It's not a good reason to stay in a relationship because it's hard to split.
So let's talk about that a little bit and double click. So I'm just curious, do you work with all co-founders, or what co-founders you won't work with?
I won't work with co-founders who aren't, first of all, aren't willing to have the hard conversations, like where I'd have to be forcing that to happen. And there's not a willingness to participate. So that's one. I think that's hard to filter for. And sometimes people don't know what that looks like. And so I do try to educate first and try to give the resources. For me, teams where I don't think I can help them with an amicable split, I also probably wouldn't work with them. So that would be if there's contempt. Contempt is the number one predictor of divorce, coming from Julie and John Gottman. If they see a couple behaving with contempt and resentment, that's kind of like the kiss of death. And I think the same with co-founding teams, with that trust has been broken and there's not an ability to build that back or a willingness to build back.
You would become this mediator as opposed to being a coach.
Yeah. And at that point, I do recommend folks seek like legal mediation if I see that. So there is a course of action. It's just not.
Okay. That makes a lot. And so if there was a piece of advice, one piece of advice, what would you tell co-founders who are starting out together?
My biggest piece of advice would be not to forget that there's a relational side to venture building, and that choosing to start your own company is one of the wildest, most unpredictable journeys ever. So even if you've worked with someone or been friends with them for 20 years, how they show up in a startup space most likely will look different. Like how that person handles rejection, how they handle uncertainty, how they handle change. It's going to look different. And so give yourself time to experiment with how that person shows up in those circumstances, as well as yourself, before you actually sign any contracts or make things real. Work with that person, even if that's something as small as hosting an event. You get to see how they show up day of, how they manage stress, how they manage other stakeholders. And so really put that relationship to the test.
So high stake, high risk situations, but short term in order to test that. I mean, events are actually a great way to do that. I run a lot of tech events, a lot on. Do you have any questions that I should be asking you?
I think one question I get asked a lot is like, do I need a co-founder? Because then, I mean, the premise of this podcast is how I met my co-founder, and almost makes the assumption that everyone needs one.
Well, also, to be fair, a lot of VCs want co-founding teams as opposed to solo founders.
Yeah. And I think that that's also historically that's been true, that investors really want to invest in founding teams being multiple people. I've actually talked to some investors recently who own investments. And so it's really interesting to see, I don't know if I'd call it a shift, but to see the openness. And for those solo founders, the path forward is to have a team that has the support that you need. And whatever that dynamic looks like, maybe it's having a really strong advisor, or maybe it's bringing on a founding engineer or a founding technical leader, but maintaining your decision-making rights as a solo founder because you're not great at sharing decisions, and that's not how you want to. So my first question to folks who come to me and ask if everyone needs a co-founder is why do you? And if the answer is because of VC pressure, I say, let's think twice about what your ideal team looks like and how you can get there, navigating those pressures, but there's a story that you can tell, and just don't default to that. Make sure that it's a choice. It's better to to go it alone than to go it with the wrong person.
I actually have a question for you, given like how I assess founders and founding teams, and I was just mentoring at Techstars this morning in the New York program. What I look for, even though it's two people, is three different pillars. It's the visionary, it's the super connector, and it's the operator, and that can actually scale the thing. And so some people have one or two of those three pillars, but if they are by themselves, I look for someone, generally the visionary aspect, and they know what to hire to overcompensate their weaknesses in a way. And if they have that awareness, then they're a strong founder. If they don't, that's when it becomes difficult. I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on what I just said, and if just to have your perspective.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I like your framework. I think any framework, like, just have one, like how you think about different roles in a team, and then how you think about your gaps, that you need to be articulate about that, about your strengths and about where you need to be filled in or complemented. And having a perspective on that is incredibly important as a founder, especially when you're hiring or looking for, you want someone to conceit that picture. And again, I really like your framework. I think there's probably a few others out there, but pick what resonates with you. Just be able to be articulate about what you bring and also what you're looking for to kind of round you out. And I'd even say round you out like functionally, skill set wise, but also socially, leadership wise, and then also emotionally. So think across all three of those pillars.
So let's talk about these co-CEO things that kind of hear about, read about.
I think the industry is I would say anti co-CEOs, and the hesitations there are that it's a duo that is punting the conversation. So that's kind of the perception of the industry. I would say I've worked with some very thoughtful and successful co-CEOs, and what they do well, that I don't think everyone does, is they had an internal job description for each of them that was different.
So the ratio is clear, but
yeah,
if you talk project management, like roles and responsibilities are just so clear that nobody goes on the other person's lane.
Exactly. And especially in an early stage, it's like, really, what is your title? You do a lot of things together. As long as you have the definition internally, titles are more of an external communicator. And so I think it's possible. I would say if you do identify as co-CEOs and you realize that you're doing it because you're punting the conversation on titles and responsibilities, have a conversation about that. But if you're a co-CEO and you say like, no, I know exactly what I do, I know exactly what my co-founder does, and I know where we want to grow, what we want to grow into.
It's about communication.
It's always about communication. And I think that any dynamic can work as long as you've discussed it.
Yeah. And so there's always that part you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. And I suppose that's when you fill in the gap in a way where you kind of shed light on things and anticipate things and situations. And a lot of your work is actually about de-risking businesses and anticipating conflict. So just to kind of wrap up and summarize a little bit, these are my takeaways. I love the conversation is communicate. Try to anticipate as much upfront, put everything in writing, be honest with yourself, be honest with the other person, whether you know them really, really well or you don't. And definitely have a pilot dating phase and a high risk, high yield kind of situation in order to really get to know one another in the situations that are very real. All right. Well, thanks, Annie, for sharing more about your science and what you do. And to introduce to a bunch of founders. Can't believe that 65% of startups fail because of conflict between founders. That's ridiculous.
It's insane. The biggest business risk that no one's talking about.
Right.
Well, thank you for being here and
Thanks,
creating the conversation. Like, having more conversations like this is what changed industries. So thank you for being a fantastic guest.
Thank you. Me.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show this week. Please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode of the show. I'm Annie Garofalo, and thank you for listening to How I Met My Co-Founder.